Hazardous materials are an unfortunate necessity in some people's daily lives. Whether they work with chemicals to produce goods or deal with the effects of those chemicals when they get out of control, there are many people who know they're working in a dangerous environment, but just as many who are in the middle, doing their job which happens to bring them into contact with hazardous materials on occasion. Most of the time, safety precautions are put in place to protect everyone who comes in contact with a dangerous substance. Sometimes, though, those safety precautions are ignored. It should go without saying that dealing with any kind of explosive material is a very dangerous task, and it requires a lot of safety precautions to be put in place ahead of time. But sometimes those precautions just aren't enough and accidents happen anyway. That's exactly what occurred in Kingman, Arizona, one fateful afternoon in July of 1973. As it was there, a railroad car carrying a full tank of propane exploded and killed a dozen people. Kingman is a fairly small desert community located along Route 66, about 80 miles southeast of Las Vegas. It was so small, in fact, back in the early 70s, its population only reached 7,500 and its fire department was staffed by just 6 firefighters and 36 volunteers. Not that they had much need for a bigger department though. After all, very little of note actually happened there. If anything, the biggest issue the locals had to deal with was the often sweltering heat. And that was the exact scenario playing itself out on July 5th of that year, as the temperature was in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Yes, it was the kind of weather which made it difficult to do anything, and that made things harder not just for the Kingman citizens, but also the workers of the Doxal gas distribution plant located on the east side of the town around 2 miles from the downtown area. While for most others, making the odd error in the heat would be forgivable, for the plant workers that would not be the case, as their job involved offloading tanks filled with propane gas from rail cars, then carefully storing their contents on site for later use. On that day, it was a particularly large delivery that was coming in because a 33,500-gallon capacity car listed as tank car number 38214 was due to arrive around 1:30 p.m. Of course, even with such a high-risk task needing to be carried out, the low population of Kingman meant there weren't exactly a lot of staff members on site. No, on an ordinary day, as little as 4 people could be expected to be present in the building, with these including a clerk, a manager, and 2 delivery personnel. That said, on July 5th, there weren't even that many people available. In fact, there were only 3 staff members on hand. Still, Doxal obviously felt confident that that was enough to get the job done safely, and so when the offloading process began later that afternoon, there was no call for additional staff support. But then why would there be? After all, this was a pretty routine job for the gas distribution plant. Sure, it was risky as they were dealing with liquefied propane gas, meaning it was much denser than it would have been in its gaseous state. But everyone involved had done it 1,000 times before, and there was really no reason to worry. That was, until things got started and one of the 2 men involved in hooking up all of the relevant valves noticed a small leak in the connection. When he tried to fix the problem, instead of repairing it, he only served to make things worse. How was that? Well, rather than use a non-sparking brass alloy wrench to tighten the connection and stop the leak as safety regulations demanded, he instead used a regular aluminum alloy wrench. And that proved to be a major mistake, as the aluminum striking the steel fitting was enough to create a spark that managed to ignite and from there combust into a localized fire that shot flames 70 to 80 feet into the air in a V shape. Of course, both workers, each of whom were in close vicinity to the blast, were severely injured as a result of that. Hell, they were outright thrown from the top of the tank car with their clothing on fire, with one being so badly burned that he was unable to move from the spot he landed. As for the other man, though, while he was also suffering from pretty severe wounds, he was at least able to make his way back to the office building where he alerted the other staff member on site as to what had happened. At that point, realizing the potential severity of the situation should the entire tank of propane blow, that worker immediately drove him to the Arizona Department of Public Safety office about a quarter-mile away where the two formally reported the incident. Obviously then, the next logical step was to get both the injured man now sitting in the public safety office and the other one who was still on the scene to the hospital as quickly as possible. Once that was done, it was imperative they contacted the fire department for help. So that's exactly what staff at the Department of Public Safety office did, with Kingman firefighters first being alerted at 1:57 p.m. And luckily, because of the small size of the town, it didn't take long for those same firefighters to arrive on scene. Though when they did, they immediately realized they were faced with a much bigger problem than they could handle themselves. Obviously, for a team whose numbers were so small, a fire situated on a 33,500-gallon propane tank was not going to be manageable, especially as it was in a liquefied state. The very fact it was in such a state was what made the situation so susceptible to having a bleave occur. I'm sure you're asking yourself, what exactly is a bleave? Well, it's an acronym for boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, and it is very much as unpleasant as it sounds. Basically, when gases are liquefied ahead of time in order to allow for higher volumes to be transported in a more economical manner, the trade-off is that the potential for disaster should something go wrong is much, much worse. That's right. While gases have a variety of differing critical temperatures depending on which one is being discussed, they're all generally far above that of a liquid. And when it comes to liquid propane, this is doubly true as such a substance has a boiling point of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also -40 degrees Celsius. So, when you take into account the reality that the average ambient temperature in this part of the United States during 1973 was around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not hard to see why it was a potential problem. The only reason it was safe to transport such cargo at all, in fact, was because the pressure within the tank pressing down on it kept from reaching critical mass. But as the people of Kingman were finding out, that pressure could also have a negative effect if it got too intense. Realizing they were in urgent need of assistance, the team on scene placed calls to both the Truxton Canyon and Hualapai fire districts explaining the situation and asking for help. Not that it would do much good though, because while the crew were trying their best to maintain control of things until aid could arrive, that force within the tank was finally going to reach dangerous levels. By now, while the initial blast thankfully hadn't affected the majority of the contents within, the heat created by it was causing it to boil, and as a result of that boiling, things inside were reaching levels that, if left unchecked for too long, were going to cause something to give and lead to an even larger and deadlier explosion. Sure, there was a failsafe designed for such an occurrence in the form of a pressure release valve, but in this particular case, the fire was so hot that it caused the pressure to intensify quicker than it could be brought back down, meaning the whole thing was turning into a ticking time bomb. So in order to try and combat that, the first responders on scene had taken to aiming cold water directly at the fire, not in an attempt to put the flames out as water wouldn't work on burning propane, but instead to cool the overall temperature and lower that pressure as best they could. Of course, such a thing required a lot of water, and while there was a hydrant about 1,200 feet away from the scene, the crew didn't have enough hose with them to create the two separate supply lines they needed to battle the blaze from both sides. Even if they had, it likely wouldn't have made much of a difference by that point because time was simply moving too fast. In fact, it's estimated that between the fire department being contacted and them arriving at the scene, 8 minutes had already passed. And as if that wasn't bad enough, a further 2 minutes after that was spent trying to hook up their hoses to the hydrant. So when you add that to the 9 minutes that had elapsed before they were ever called at all, it meant that things were right in the middle of that critical zone of the 15 to 20 minutes it would take for things to blow. And that's exactly what happened when, as the first hose was being charged at around 2:10 p.m., the temperature inside the tank finally reached its limit and, as a result, the liquid within the tank was released into the open air, causing it to be instantly converted into gas once more. Of course, when that gas hit the flame, it resulted in a second explosion, one even worse than the first, as now, rather than being localized to a single entry point, it was the entire rail car that blew up. The explosion was so bad that one half of the tank actually left a 10-foot crater in its wake before bouncing end over end westward along the tracks, with it eventually landing around 1,200 feet or 365 meters away from its original location. As to the other half, though, well, that didn't go flying into the air. No, instead the blast tore it along its welds and ended up flattening it to the ground. But that was arguably a worse scenario, as now a ground-level fireball was able to escape and travel 150 to 200 feet in all directions. As if that wasn't bad enough, following that, a shockwave was sent out 5 miles into the distance as burning propane rained down on everything and everyone in the vicinity. Then a further mushroom cloud of flames was sent into the air after that, with its span stretching out to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 feet, or between 250 and 300 meters in diameter. But it wasn't just the size of the blast that was a problem. It was the intense heat created by it. Approximately 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,925 degrees Celsius in fact. That was the temperature those next to the explosion were subjected to when it occurred, and the firefighters on scene weren't the only ones who that applied to either, because as a result of the radiant heat, 5 buildings nearby went up in a blaze themselves, with those including a tire company, a restaurant, a truck stop, and the gas company office building itself. While this was a disaster for the people who owned and operated those facilities, it paled in comparison to the suffering the emergency services were undergoing as, while many of them were wearing full protective gear made out of cotton duck and polycarbonate plastic, some were only dressed in either a basic coat and helmet or just a coat itself. Clearly, for those unlucky dozen who were within 150 feet of the epicenter, the effects of the explosion would be disastrous as their clothes were burnt off of their bodies entirely, with that leading to 3 of them dying immediately and 8 more being burned so badly they would pass away at the hospital soon after. But they weren't the only ones hurt, because a railroad worker and a state trooper would also get caught up in the scene and be severely injured as well. It was a catastrophe unlike the small settlement of Kingman had ever seen before, but even then it still could have been much worse. Why is that? Well, by the time the second blast occurred, news had gotten around town as to what was happening, and that led to over 100 onlookers gathering to watch the scene play out. Sure, the fire department had tried to keep them at a safe distance by attempting to set up roadblocks 1,000 feet from the fire, but eventually that wasn't far enough because once things went from bad to worse, while no spectators would be close enough to be killed, they would ultimately be close enough to get injured as well. In addition to the 12 deaths, if we include the initial plant worker who'd by now died in the hospital, as well as the multiple injuries picked up by the authorities on scene, over 90 of the curious onlookers were burned so badly they'd have to be taken to the hospital as well. In fact, some were injured to such a severe degree as a result of being in the vicinity of the propane tank that they had to be airlifted out of the area and taken to hospitals in Las Vegas and Phoenix. One person who managed to escape, however, was Hank Graham, a retired railroad conductor who'd been photographing the whole disaster from the roof of his home nearby. And it's just as well he was okay, because outside of a grainy 8mm film captured by a family vacationing in the area, his images would be where much of the visual documentation of the scene was gathered. Seriously, it's only because of him that we have any photos of the mushroom cloud at all, and because of his documentation, it's made it a whole lot easier for fire department training programs to study the incident after the fact. But any such studies were for the future back then as, in the moment, the fire was still raging. And that was why, realizing the situation was still fraught with risk, further calls were sent out by the local emergency services to fire departments in Lake Havasu City, Mojave Valley, and Bullhead City asking for emergency aid. Luckily, each of them quickly responded by setting up a joint command post at Kingman Fire Station 2, and from there sending out teams to help battle the blaze. While they were doing that, the Bureau of Land Management was also dispatching a number of slurry bombers to fly over and dump fire retardant mixtures onto the flames, which had by then spread out across the highway. In the end, the combination of all that was enough to eventually get the situation under control without any more casualties being caused, and, come 5:30 p.m., the last of the fires had been extinguished. But while the immediate danger was over, it wasn't the end of the story, because with 12 people dead and countless more injured, questions began being asked about how such a thing could have been allowed to happen in the first place. After all, with the risk being so high in this line of work, it was expected the proper safety measures would be taken at all times. It soon became clear during a subsequent investigation the use of an aluminum alloy wrench certainly didn't meet up with what those measures should have been. As a direct result of such a poor practice, a lot of lives had been snuffed out in an instant. As if that wasn't bad enough, over $1 million of material damage had been caused to the local area as a result of offshoot fires. So clearly, safety codes had to be looked at and revised, with that leading to a situation where, in the future, all propane storage tanks had to be moved to a location closer to the airport and placed in a pit. Why a pit? Well, that way, should another accident occur, the blast would be directed upwards instead of outwards, meaning there was far less likelihood of there being any civilian casualties. But that wasn't all that came out of those new safety measures because, in the years since, manufacturing upgrades were made to all rail cars which saw them outfitted with both an outer layer of insulation and a tank skin surrounding the inner tank. The reason this was important was because it added approximately 1 hour of flame impingement time before a bleed would likely occur. Of course, for as much as that's a good thing for modern-day workers to have, it doesn't change the fact that 12 people had to die in order for such measures to be enacted at all. And at the end of the day, no matter what else is taken from this story, their names should always be remembered. So at this point, it's necessary to list these names for the record. First, there was the initial plant worker who became the initial casualty of the disaster, Marvin Mast, the manager of Doxol Propane at the time. Outside of him, there were 11 firefighters who lost their lives too, with the youngest of them being 25-year-old Arthur Stringer, a Vietnam War veteran who'd only been volunteering with the service for around 1 month before the disaster took place. It truly was a tragedy that he had to get caught up in the situation, but it was equally as tragic that both the 27-year-old service manager for the local Double G Tire Company, Roger Hubka, and 28-year-old volunteer Frank Henry also became victims. But of course, they weren't even the half of it because 4 men in their 30s, namely highway patrolman and part-time fireman Alan Hansen, 16-year veteran volunteer Joseph Chambers, gas station owner Donald Webb, and certified first aid instructor Christopher Sanders would also meet their end on that fateful day. As if that wasn't enough, added to the list of deaths were 41-year-old Little League manager John Campbell, 57-year-old high school principal Richard Lee Williams, 52-year-old William Kaysen, and finally 55-year-old Myron Cox. So, as can clearly be seen, these weren't just emergency service workers who died during the worst disaster the town had ever seen. No, they were also valued members of the community, and for that reason it took Kingman a long time to recover. But they would recover in the end, and they never forget the sacrifices those men made to protect their home, which is exactly why, 40 years on, tributes are still being paid to the fallen in the form of remembrance services. It's not just remembrance services that are keeping their memories alive, though. No, on top of that, a memorial park has also been dedicated to the incident and those who died during it. And if that wasn't enough, the legacy created by what happened actually managed to inspire relatives of many of those left behind to become firefighters themselves. Believe it or not, the Kingman Fire Department now has a significantly increased staff made up of several sons, nephews, and uncles of those who either perished that day or who were working as firefighters somewhere else nearby. And of those, perhaps the most prominent is Charles Osterman, the current chief of the Department of Kingman, who was only 16 years old when the disaster happened. While he remains happy to pick up the torch that was left behind by his elders, Osterman has no intention of ever exposing himself or his men to such a situation again. No, with new safety measures now in place and increased funding allowing the crew to upgrade the quality of their equipment, he's hopeful another Doxol disaster will never take place. That said, no matter how many precautions are taken, and no matter how good someone's equipment is, there always remains the risk of another incident occurring. Such was the case in 2013 when 19 firefighters were killed in the Arizona Yarnell Hill fire, an even deadlier incident than the one that took place in Kingman 4 decades prior. So perhaps the real lesson to be learned is that fire is an element which simply can't be tamed by humanity. If we want to continue tempting fate by dealing in explosive materials like propane, we're going to have to accept the fact that we're always going to be putting our lives on the line to some degree, no matter how safe we think we are. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.